Hello and welcome to the Feeder Series podcast. I am your host, Jim Kimberley, and today we are talking all about F2 and F1 Academy, who kicked off their season in Saudi Arabia, F2 obviously doing their second round, with four chaotic, crazy, non-stop, relentless races. And fortunately, I've got, again, Stephen Walton and Martin Lloyd, our F2 editors from Feeder Series, joining me. We've also got a podcast debut from Kalle Kukaski, who's our F1 Academy editor, and a podcast debut, more excitingly than everybody, no offense to the other three, but Chloe Chong, who I have to say, thank you so much for joining us, Chloe, because I messaged you about half an hour before we started recording thinking, you know what, maybe Chloe can come and join us, because I saw that you and a certain F1 Academy champion were watching the race, well, on your Instagram story. And, first, welcome to the podcast, Chloe. And how did you find the race? How did you enjoy last year? How's everything going from your side?
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I know it was a bit last minute, but I saw the races and I was like, you know what, there's a lot to talk about. So it'd be fun to, I guess, talk about it some more with some more racing fans. So, right now I'm doing great. We started preseason testing.
This is for British F4.
Yes, for British F4, and it's going really, really well. So excited to kick the season off, but also it's great to see F1 Academy starting up again and seeing them all race. You know, some close friends there racing. It does feel a bit like, you know, you want to be there, but you're not. But it's great to see it on the TV live and to I guess watch, you know, my friends do quite well. So yeah, I think it's been a strong weekend from all of them.
I love how you say my friend's doing well. That's one of those things I think in F1 Academy, there's a lot of camaraderie there that's not necessarily seen in the higher ranks. Everybody seems quite friendly. And let's just go through this Instagram story briefly, because you were sharing on that on your Instagram that you were watching it with a close friend. Could you give us a little bit more detail?
Yeah, so Marta came over to stay for a couple of days just now, and yeah, we watched the races together. We definitely, like, Marta's quite vocal, so if something happens, which a lot happened in the race, she gets quite vocal. So it was the neighbours probably weren't that happy, to be honest.
We are talking about Marta Garcia, the F1 Academy 2023 champion, of course, who is going to be into FRECA this year. And Kalle, this year we've got FRECA driver coming in. We've also got other drivers coming from everywhere. Let's not go and focus just on one, with Maya coming in. But this was a hell of a start to the season. Saudi Arabia isn't the easiest of tracks, and especially in race 2, it did seem that F1 Academy was finding a little bit of difficulty, a little bit of teething problems, a little bit of drama non-stop. How did you find your first weekend covering F1 Academy for Feeder Series?
Yeah, it was very exciting, a little bit chaotic. I would definitely say for both myself and some of the drivers, there was a bit of a learning curve, which makes sense, especially on the track that it's at. But yeah, pretty exciting. I was very thrilled to be covering it. It's my first weekend covering any racing series. So I don't know, I found it all quite exciting.
Yeah, well, I have to sympathise with you. There was a lot to go. I mean, anything that could happen in an F4 race, I felt did happen in an F4 race. There was safety cars, 2 checkered flags, red flags after the race, crashes, carnage. It was just bonkers to watch. Were you able to keep up on everything that happened? And I know we're going to talk about F2 as well, of course. It was trying its best to go at that same sort of pace. But were you able to keep up to date with everything that was happening? Because I seem to have lost my mind trying to remember everything that happened, because it was non-stop racing, especially race 2.
Yeah, I think so. I had a lot of tabs open, various spreadsheets. I'm keeping track of things for myself on my own Google Sheet. So, you know, when the penalties were coming out, I was trying to figure out, you know, the reclassification, so I could get ahead on figuring out what happened. You know, and the Dorian pin penalty, for example, took quite a while. So there was a lot of waiting to figure out where the dust had settled. But I think
let me
let
just touch on that briefly, because of course what we're talking about here is the second checkered flag when Dorian went around the circuit at full pace for a lap afterwards, which has left us in this really unusual situation where she is now third place in the championship despite crossing the finish line first in both races and getting 2 pole positions, which is a little bit crazy. Chloe, while we've got you here, how much do you get into the zone when you're racing around the track? Because the talk was that Prema didn't let her know that the checkered flag had finished. The checkered flag wasn't really fully unfurled when they waved it. Is this the sort of thing that was a teething problem for somebody coming over from endurance racing, or is this a technical problem? How would you interpret it?
Okay, so I think there's many ways that you can interpret it. From what I saw on the TV and from what I saw from the onboard of her fastest lap, you couldn't really see the checkered flag. It was really hard because I was hidden behind a light board. So when you're going past it at that pace, especially so low down, unless you're seeing it visibly, it's very, very hard. And I think for Dorian, especially when she was told the lap before, go push for the fastest lap, she probably thought there was still, some time left in the race. And afterwards, there was some communication issues with the team. I think she asked, when is the race over, and she didn't get a reply. It could be, due to issues with the radio communication on the circuit, etc. But I think one thing that we have to remember is that the radios in this championship are actually optional. Like, you don't have to use them. It's kind of like, it's not like necessary that you use them. So as a driver, you're meant to be responsible for, being aware of your surroundings and everything. So I think, I sympathise with Dorian for having, those difficulties with not seeing the checkered flag, not getting the radio communication. Like for me, transferring to British F4, we're meant to get radios this year, but our team doesn't have them yet. And I've had so much trouble, trying to figure out where the pit board is, especially at Silverstone, where, you're at the braking point. You have to look over to the pit board while you're going past the braking point. So I know it's so difficult, but also as a driver, you've got to remember that it's your responsibility to, look in your mirrors, look at your surroundings, and kind of process what's going on. So I think it's a difficult one from that perspective, but on the FIA side, the regulations say that she must have a penalty. So it's good to see that they're, doing what they're saying. I feel bad for Dorian that she's lost, a win that she truly deserves, but I'm sure that it'll make her learn in the future and it'll make her a better driver, out of it.
You're very, very eloquent there, Chloe. I enjoyed everything you had to say there. And I can't imagine how difficult... I mean, I can't pick up a braking marker myself, let alone look at a braking marker and look at a pit wall to try and read something. Just sticking with F1 Academy, I know Stephen and Martin waiting very patiently for the F2, and there's a little bit to talk about there as well. But I want to make the most of having Chloe joining us. And let me just go to you briefly, Calla, as well. That we have now the championship leaders of Abby Pulling, Maya Weg, and Dorian Pan, who are the top three, and they seem to be almost in a league of their own at the front of the championship as well. Are you expecting these three to be the ones that we're going to see fighting for the title at the other 6 rounds?
That definitely seems likely. I think we're in an interesting situation, the same situation as Formula One, actually, where the first races where the drivers did substantial testing before the weekend. So they definitely got a lot of practice on this specific circuit, although for most, if not all of them, that probably would have been the first time they'd ever driven around that circuit otherwise. So I think that will definitely impact how the first races end up. We also have a lot of very talented rookies, and Pin and Vug are both new to the series, but we have Leah Block, who's a lot younger and was at points in this weekend looking like, and was running in the points. And then I was also impressed by another Chloe Chambers, who also looked strong with I think like less experience than Pin, Pulling, and Vug. So I think there's definitely some people that we will see coming up and challenging from below in the standings at the moment, but it does seem that those three, but particularly Pin and Pulling, are pulling ahead, so to speak.
Oh, somebody had to do it, and Calla went for it. I love that. It's going to be the pun that keeps on giving all year, I think. Chloe, just talk about Chloe Chambers and strong. She was very strong into the back of Lola's car, sadly, at turn 1, and
And
That
then Lola was strung into the side of Leah's.
Yeah, I mean, that was the epitome of a T-boning sort of incident. And Leah, you're correct, seemed to be doing pretty well for essentially coming into a completely different racing category. I mean, the curbs bounced her off quite harshly on race one, but then she seemed to be running pretty well, apart from the repeat penalties. It was one of those races that snowballed. It was like the incident, and then there was the penalty, then another penalty, then speed. It just seemed to get worse and worse for her. But Chloe, the panic you have when you're in an incident, which Lola was sideways across the track at turn one, and then she pulled out, and Leah unfortunately hit her. What's it like when I've done the PlayStation games and iRacing and things like this, and you do want to just go, oh no, I've spun, let me just get back there, or press the replay button. That's not the case in real life. What's it like when you're in that situation? Can you blame her for having that problem?
So from what I saw from the incident, I think it was both quite unfortunate on both sides. In my opinion, I don't think that Lola should have pulled out when she did, when she knew there was loads of cars coming behind her. But obviously, when you're in that situation, you've got the adrenaline pumping through your veins, and you're like, damn, just lost a place. I've been spun out. I think you could be thinking of a lot of things, and I think probably the most important for Lola was to get back on track, especially with the clutch that we have, which is quite a stiff foot clutch. It's not like you can it's really hard to feather it and kind of stop, and so when she started pulling out, she had to pull out, and I think that's what made it unfortunate. It's not like, oh, okay, Leah's right here, you can't stop really. But when you're coming off the clutch, it's very difficult, and then you have to go back on. And I think having that panic whilst in such a high intensity, high adrenaline race, you don't really think about all these other factors. But I think surely Lola's looking back on what happened, and probably she's probably saying the same thing. Why did she do that? And she probably knows that it was a bit of a panic in the moment sort of thing. So I think she gets a penalty, and I think we can move on from that, to be honest.
Yeah, I hope so. I'm hoping that it was one of those first race weekends that is a lot of a learning for everybody. And yeah, one of the things that I kind of learned, and Cal, I want to hear your take on this, and then we'll move on to the F2 side of things. The penalties came down, we mentioned for Leah Block, but the penalties didn't seem to come down so much for Bianca Bustamante, who had a different track, it looked like, especially at turn one. I can't remember seeing her go round turn one that many times. Were you finding it quite interesting that the stewarding decisions seem to range from quite harsh, which, I mean, Dorian's was kind of inevitable from precedent, but then we saw a 5 or 10 place grid drop for the next race in the current race, which I've never seen before. But then you saw Bianca kind of getting away with things.
Well, the 10th place one was for Lola, right?
Yeah.
That was for the collision with Block. So, I mean, what we did see, I think, with Bianca cutting that first corner, which a lot of drivers were doing, was in the first race. I think that she struggled with that. And then in the second race, Chambers got a 5-second penalty mid-race, I believe mid-race, for doing the same thing, for leaving the track and gaining an advantage at that spot. So I think after the first race, maybe 2 hours after, Levenfoss also got a penalty in that one. I off the top of my head can't remember what for, and I was expecting
if you could remember every penalty, I think that's almost Rain Man levels of intelligence, because there were just non-stop penalties. The stewards dishing them out non-stop. So I completely understand if you don't remember them all, but please continue.
No, yeah, I think maybe at that I was thinking maybe there would be one for the black and white flag for track limits for Bustamante for that corner, but there wasn't, and that's how it goes. I don't think it was. I mean, we saw it a couple times on what they showed on the TV, which is all I have access to. And I believe she got the black and white flag. And if the stewards didn't see anything else, that's probably all there was. But I think it appeared like maybe there was a larger discrepancy than there was. I also think it's the first time that F1 Academy has an audience quite this large. There's, it's being live streamed on both X and on YouTube. And the weekend is confusing me. On Saturday morning, when I checked to see how many people had watched the Friday race, it was something like the views that showed up was something like 250,000, which is a lot. And that probably just shows, every time somebody joins again, that's another count. But that's a lot of people watching. So I think there's also just a lot of eyes and a lot of, uproar coming about any small thing that happens in the race compared to last year, and then compared to any F4 series I can think of. So I think there's just I wouldn't say a inordinate amount of attention, but a much larger amount of attention than has ever been on the series.
Yeah, I did speak to Bianca briefly at Formula Winter Series, and she did say that the attention that those guys were getting compared to the other competitors, because of the Formula One backing, because of the publicity they get in F1 Academy, was sizable. Mike, now I'm going to come to you, but I just want to say goodbye, to Chloe, but one final thing, because we have got a sizable gap until the next race, which does lose momentum a little bit in F1 Academy. What was it like, Chloe? Then please feel free to leave. The gap you had, because you had quite an intense calendar at the start of your season, then you had this massive wait until Kota. What do you do in that gap? Because it was a couple of months, I think.
Well, actually, for me, I think it would have been, much more useful for me to have those sorts of gaps between last year's races. I got called up to Prema quite late, so one, I wasn't physically prepared, and two, I just had no testing. So it was very, very difficult for me to kind of find my footing. It was like one race, damn, like the next race is coming up next week. How am I going to prepare myself for that? It can be a good thing, because then you can kind of, take all those things that you want to learn and implement it straight away. But on a physical side, going to a track like Valencia or Zandvoort, it is so difficult to physically get up to that level that all the other drivers are at when you've had 2 weeks. Okay, like you're going to join Prema, you're going to do this test day, and that's it. So for me, like between Paul Ricard and Kota, it was so much preparation. I was like, okay, I felt so bad this first half of the season. I was losing so much time just because I literally couldn't steer the steering wheel. And I was going to put everything into it. So it was like every day I'd wake up, go to the gym. We started renting a sim, because loads of our like teammates, competitors, they were all saying that helped so much. And actually at the beginning of the year, Prema discouraged us from buying a sim, because they said it wasn't going to help. They didn't want it to distract me from their team sim. But we finally decided during the summer break to invest and try renting one out. So we did that, and it helped so much. Like just sim every day, training every day, just little things like mindset, some stuff with Xavier at 321 Perform for the psychological side, and all of that put together, it just shows how strong my performance was in Kota, just that preparation. So I think for these drivers this year, like having these big gaps between the races means that they can thoroughly like reflect on how the race went, how the crashes went, how they could have changed that. Maybe stuff was out their control, but it's just about putting stuff into your mental bank and growing from it. So I think it's actually very, very helpful to have these gaps between races, because it also means that they can have testing, they can train, they can work on stuff that they were weak on. And when they come back, maybe we'll see a completely different driver. So I think it's very useful in a championship like this, especially so high profile, to give them time to develop, especially as young drivers.
Chloe, I can't thank you enough for coming on. The insight you've given with these answers is tremendous. I'm going to wish you well, and please come back on the podcast later this year. Thank you so much for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Thank you guys for having me on. Yeah, it was a pleasure to speak, and hopefully I'll talk soon.
You absolutely will. Best of luck with the campaign. I'm going to come to you now, Martin, that you were going to say something there. Yes, you can. Of course you can.
Could I jump in really quick? Yeah, I think there's definitely some of the drivers are racing in other series this year. So we'll see Abby Pulling racing with Chloe Chong at British F4, where Abby Pulling has experience in that series before, and I could definitely see her making, especially given her performance in this weekend, making a, title challenge there. And then obviously Dorian Pin is racing in the World Endurance Championship, which is, another level really. But then we also have drivers like Maya Vug, who I think maybe some people expected to perform a bit higher than she did this weekend. But unlike, Pin, who's been racing all winter, as far as I know, she really hasn't since Freca. So I think, the space between races will definitely affect the championship standings.
Yeah.
How? I don't know yet, but I will definitely change some things.
Yeah, it's a really good point from Chloe, I thought, about having a bit more time to prep. So it was something I hadn't really considered, which is the beauty of having drivers come and speak. But I also want to hear from non-drivers. So please, Martin, Stephen, jump in. You've been waiting so patiently. Thank you.
I was going to say, I thought that answer from Chloe was actually really insightful, because it's something that I guess I've been thinking about a lot with the F2 calendar this year, is it's almost broken up into like little mini seasons in a way. So like we've got Bahrain was last week, Saudi Arabia this week, and then in 2 weeks' time we go to Australia, and then we're basically off for about 5 or 6 weeks before we come back for Imola, I think it is. And we see that throughout the year. So it'll be interesting, to see if, I guess so far we've seen drivers like, I think Kush Miney has been one of the stars in F2 in the first 2 races. Who else comes to mind?
We've had
Aaron, Dennis Hauger's been quite consistent as well, and it'll be interesting, I guess, using them as examples, in the next block of races, whether they're still at the front or if others jump up. But that's just my two cents on that.
Oh, please, and Martin, I know you were trying to say something. I think I've made you wait about 20 minutes before you can get those first words in, so I do apologise.
That's all good. No, I just wanted to agree with Calla's point that she made a few minutes ago about the attention that's on F1 Academy. I think sometimes, scrolling social media yesterday afternoon, and you see people talking about the incidents that happened, and of course there were some things that some of the drivers could have done better, but I think what we forget is that it is a Formula 4 series. These are largely inexperienced drivers, and there's a lot more attention on this particular F4 series than there is on, say, Spanish F4, Italian F4. It's not on the F1 support weekend, and a really, really difficult track, streamed live to such a large audience. I think it's something that people have really got to remember sometimes, that these drivers are still inexperienced, and just because they're on the F1 support roster with F2 and F3, I think it's really important that people don't forget that this is an F4 series, and these things are going to happen. And I think yesterday's race was maybe showcasing that a little bit, but obviously there was some moments of real quality as well. So I think it's important that we sometimes take a step back and realise it is not maybe the same level of racing always as some of the other championships we cover, because these drivers are less experienced. I think that's a really important point.
Can I now show my true professionalism and segue this into F2, Martin, by saying it wasn't just F1 Academy that was struggling, the drivers out there, because Formula 2 was full of yellow flag, safety cars, incidents, stalls, again, almost everything that was in the F4 race. Now, you, Martin and Stephen, had to cover this, and I mean, I've watched 5 races this weekend, and my brain is a little bit frazzled. So, Martin, you mentioned the experience, the inexperience of the F1 Academy, but the F2 relatively experienced drivers, some of them racing there for the second year, they didn't fare that much better either. So, how did you view the F2 weekend?
Yeah, well, this is the next point I wanted to make, was that there's the inexperience in F1 Academy, and then in F2 there's Formula 2, which kind of, sometimes you think it doesn't have any rules. It was so unpredictable this weekend. You had 3 drivers stalling in the 2 races, including both Williams Academy drivers in the first race. You had Amaury Cordial coming in 5th place, which I think if you'd have told me that at the start of the weekend, I would be asking you if pigs fly. So it's a really good result for him, and it's also really interesting to show that F2 can still be unpredictable even with these new cars. And you have a photo finish for 3rd place. You have cautions bringing cautions, as they say, over in IndyCar, and I think it was a really interesting weekend that showed how F2 is still just a little bit mental.
Yeah. Stephen, do you want to come on that point? Because at the moment we are going into the 3rd round, and let me just double check before I go and get this wrong. With the championship standings, Zane Maloney still reigning supreme, and I thought he had a pretty good weekend despite the qualifying problems. He really recovered, and so did Pepe Mide. But just before you go in, we've got Ollie Bearman, no points. Victor Martin,
Yeah,
No
where was he
points.
this weekend? He was nowhere.
No,
Yeah.
useless, that guy. So we're facing a championship which is very unpredictable, Stephen.
Yeah, very much so. I think I wouldn't have believed you if you had told me in preseason testing that by the end of the first two rounds, Victor Martins and Ollie Bearman would both be on 0 points. Obviously, Bearman for a bit of a different reason with being called up to F1.
He scored
And
some
I
points
guess
somewhere, but who cares?
Yeah, it's quite funny, isn't it, that he's now got more points in F1 than he does in F2. And yeah, he's got a better championship position in F1 than... Because I read somewhere, I haven't fully checked this, but apparently because Cordial scored points in Saudi Arabia, that Bearman is now officially last in the Formula 2 championship.
He is. He's got Roman Stanek ahead of him. He's got 13. Who got P13? Ollie Bearman's best finishing position is P15. So useless.
There you go.
He'll never go anywhere.
Yeah, so well, it'll be interesting though because we did expect Bearman and Martins to really be two of the main championship protagonists, and now they're both really on the back foot now. So it certainly opens some doors for people like Zane Maloney, who's still our championship leader, and even leaving this weekend, Enzo Fittipaldi and Dennis Hauger have very much put their foot forward with throwing themselves in with some strong points, and you'd be a fool to write them off. I thought Enzo Fittipaldi in particular, I guess that the Van Amersfoort team is quite new to F2, and I think it's only their second win in Formula 2, but his pace was kind of next level in that feature race. He won, I think his winning margin was over 8 seconds in the end, so not just a win, a quite dominant win in the end for Enzo. So, maybe a sign of things to come.
Martin, we saw Enzo doing extremely well, but we also saw Kushmani actually benefit this time from the withdrawal, for want of a better word, for Ollie Bearman, and he ended up inheriting pole position points for not scoring pole position, but starting on pole position. And then he was pretty strong. He didn't seem to have the pace on Fittipaldi. He seemed to be like Maloney levels last weekend of speed. But we've got, again, and no disrespect to any of these drivers, but I didn't expect to see Kushmani, Paul Aron, Pepe Marti, and his rookie season, Jack Crawford, fighting in these top positions, and they all are. Is this anything you expected?
I think it is unexpected to a degree because you go into the season this year with the idea in your head, or in my head at least, I was thinking Victor Martins, Ollie Bearman, alongside Antonelli and maybe Miata and Bortoletto, and I was thinking, are the returning drivers gonna be able to match these guys that aren't Martins and Bearman? And I thought that they've really shown that they can this weekend and last weekend as well. I think there's been a common thread of a few drivers who've been really strong, both in Saudi Arabia and in Bahrain. And we'll have to see if that plays out later in the season, in a couple of weeks in Australia and later on as well. But I think, like you were saying, Kushmani, Jack Crawford, Pepe Marti, obviously it wasn't the best weekend for him, but he still showed promise. And Zane Maloney, a difficult qualifying, but actually he brought himself back up in the races and stayed out.
He was almost on the podium, Martin. I couldn't believe it.
He really was. Yeah, got up to P4 in the sprint race, which was just insane. So I think there's a lot of drivers who have shown good form in both weekends so far. I think there's also a lot more to come from people like Victor Martins. I can't believe that that's ART's true form. I'm sure they'll figure out what's going wrong soon because it's so unlike them, especially as the team's champions. You can see that Prema are maybe not quite where they want to be yet, but they're definitely starting to get to grips with the new car.
Well, they were on pole,
Antonelli was impressive this weekend. Well, exactly. And it was actually just the lack of the one car that meant that they didn't have as much of a chance of a win. So I think it's been a positive weekend for those guys. A bit of work for ART to do, but like I said, a common thread of a few drivers, mainly the experienced ones who are really, or the second year ones who are really running through and were strong both this weekend and last weekend.
I really enjoyed F2 this weekend. I enjoyed how we saw what we got. Hauger and Fittipaldi seem to do what Zane did last time by both getting on the podium. Like drivers sprinting ahead in the sprint, and again, unexpectedly, and we said Paul Aron, who's now got 2 podium finishes in Formula 2 already, and it looks like a win's inevitable. Stephen, let me come on to you with this. The championship order now is Maloney, Fittipaldi, Hauger, Aron, Miney. Is this just an example of F2? And people have spoken about, I think they spoke about it in commentary. This is the best F2 grid we've had for years. Is this what happens when you have that level of quality, that you have drivers that you don't expect being up in these positions?
Yeah, I guess it really has been a little bit surprising with the drivers that we've seen at the front. But I think what's always shone through in F2 is that the key to winning this championship and doing well is consistency, and not necessarily always about coming first. And in some ways, it's more. In some ways, I think it's sometimes more important about where the driver finishes when they're having not so good of a weekend and not so strong. And I think we saw that this weekend with Zane Maloney, where he really had an issue in qualifying, and we saw the engine cover coming off in qualifying. Clearly things weren't quite right, and he qualified down in 15th, but he still got himself into the points in both the sprint and the feature, added to his tally, and he's retained the lead of the championship. And if every time that he's qualifying out of the top 10, if he's getting himself back into the points, then he'll go a long way in the championship. And we saw it last year with Teo Porcher, just the absolute epitome of how important being consistent is, because he only won that one race in Bahrain, yet he went on to win the championship because he just kept picking up points, picking up podiums, and kept himself at the front.
Let's move on to the worst driver in Formula 2 this year, the guy at the bottom, P22, 0 points. Ollie Bearman. I think it's worthwhile, because we are a feeder series podcast, and he did go and do some non-feeder series racing, but he's still our feeder series driver this year. They can't steal him just yet. I think it's only fair that we highlight what a mad weekend that Ollie had. And I know, Calla, you're not an F2 reporter or editor, but you're very aware of what happened with Ollie making that step up. And let's go through all three of you, but let's start with you, Calla. How did you rate Ollie's unexpected debut in Formula One, with having 1 hour of practice in a car that he's never driven before, and then almost getting into Q3, and then finishing the Grand Prix in P7?
I mean, I don't think you can say anything other than that was fantastic. Again, this weekend with the shifted days is so confusing to me, but I guess I woke up on Friday to that news being in America and was like, oh, whoa, was the reaction. I guess in the back of my mind, with no returning rookies with no rookies in Formula One, I kind of expected something to happen, somebody to step up at some point, but not quite this soon. Absolutely. So I think, by his own desires, he maybe had an underwhelming qualifying session, although from the outside, absolutely not underwhelming. But, he said, my own goal was to make it to Q3. But then I think getting P7 in the race was amazing with Norris and Hamilton, the two drivers behind him, who are both quite good drivers. And I think I was expecting maybe him to, kind of fall off a bit toward the end of the race, just because it's so long and so exhausting. But he didn't. He kept setting, or the broadcast was saying he was setting his, fastest laps of his race in the last few laps of the race. So yeah, I think pretty incredible.
Yeah, Stephen, is this an example of showing that the likes of Teo Porcher and maybe Felipe Drogovic are drivers that should probably have a chance in F1 as well, because we're seeing the quality of what an F2 driver can do in almost no practice?
Yeah, well, I thought, Ollie definitely represented F2 quite well. And I remember in the press conference it would have been on Friday, the drivers in the press conference, I think Paul Aaron in particular was sort of saying that, we really hope Ollie does well because he's sort of representing our series. And I mean, Ollie just did not look out of place in F1. He stepped up. He didn't make, I think, more importantly than where he finished and everything, I think the most important thing is he didn't put the car in the wall. He didn't make any major mistakes. The walls are so close in Saudi Arabia. And he kept kept it on the road and did finish in a really good spot in the end. But yeah, he definitely represented F2 very well.
Martin, let's finish with you on the Bearman point that he's got 6, I believe, FP1 sessions with Haas, and now he's had a unexpected FP3 session and a qualifying and a race with Ferrari, which if you told me that a week ago, yeah, I told Ollie that a week ago, wow. Now, it seemed already that he probably had a seat or something lined up, depending on his F2 performance through 2024. But would you say it's almost guaranteed? Well, it is a guarantee at this point that, irrespective of the F2 season, that he's going to be an F1 driver by 2025.
I can't believe he will not be on the F1 grid in 2025. I think not just with his performance this weekend. I think he was already on the radar. He impressed Haas a lot in Mexico and Abu Dhabi in his FP1 sessions that he's already done. But I think his performance this weekend really topped it off. And what I'd say, most impressed with was something that Carla touched on earlier. Bannon wanted more from this weekend. He's got that mentality that actually, I'm in a Ferrari, 7th place is lower than where I want to be, even though it's his first weekend. He started the weekend getting pole position in Formula 2. He suddenly parachuted in and he nearly makes Q3 and gets 6 points. I think for him to be underwhelmed by that, as you say, I think shows how almost high level his mentality is, and he thinks he should be higher up the placings. And I think it's really important that he's got that mentality. And I think that will show to the F1 teams that he's the real deal. In terms of 2025, like I say, I can't believe that he won't have a seat. Whether that's with Haas or another team, I'm not sure yet. But I think, apart from anything else, he's shown to Ferrari that they're going to need to find him somewhere. Otherwise, someone else is going to pick him up.
What an interesting turn of events it all was. I know everybody got excited about 2025 already because of the silly season, and certain 7-time champion who finishes behind an F2 driver ended up triggering things a bit worse than anybody expected and earlier. But now with Bearman in the mix as well, there's some F1 drivers who I think are really high quality who aren't going to be on the grid in 2025. I don't know who yet, but it's really going to change a lot of things with this performance. Now, I just want to finish. Last time we had the hot takes, and this time I want to finish with what we've got on a YouTube poll that we had running. And I've asked for essentially what people's star Saudi driver was. And at the current time of recording, we've got Dorian Pan, 54% of the votes, Enzo Fittipaldi, 27%, Dennis Hauger, 11%, and someone else, 7%. Some of the comments we've got for that someone else, Ollie Bearman from the Bauman's, or the very long name, I'm going to try and pronounce that, Cordial, JFran F1, special mention to Abby Pulling, Miney as well. So some comments here who are suggesting that other drivers are their star drivers. I'm going to put 3 of you on the spot from F1 Academy and F2, maybe F1. I don't know if you can classify Bearman as a feeder series driver this weekend. Carla, who would you say your top driver of the Saudi Arabian weekend is?
For me, it's Dorian Pin. And that's not even just F1 Academy. That's F2 as well. Between everything, I think she was my star driver. Unfortunate ending aside, she did absolutely everything right. She led the practice session. She led qualifying. Her 2 fastest laps were the 2 fastest laps, not just the fastest lap and second fastest lap. And she led every lap of both races. And, she didn't have to deal with some of the chaos in the middle, but she did have to defend against 3 safety car restarts, which twice she did masterfully. And one time there was maybe a little bit of doubt that she would, maintain the position. So for me, she did everything right. But I mean, Pulling was amazing as well, because she really, put herself in the place to take advantage of anything that happened. And, ultimately outside of the race by no fault of Pulling's own, she, by putting herself in the right position and an exterior circumstance, she got a win. And her first win in F1 Academy, which should be mentioned, that eluded her last year.
Mm.
So, you know, she put herself in a great position, but Dorian Pin was just, you know,
Let me
she
fill the
did what
words for
Max
you
was.
here.
Oh, go ahead.
Let me fill the words here, because TerraPog8533 on YouTube said that Dorian Pan really went the extra couple of miles this weekend, which is a very clever comment. A very, very clever comment. Let me ask the same question to you, Stephen. Your top driver from the 2 championships.
Yeah, I agree with Carla that it was Dorian Pin she was just dominant this weekend. You know, both race wins, pole position, led pretty much or led every lap. Is that right? I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And the one thing she missed was fastest lap of the first race.
Why even bother?
No.
No, dreadful.
Yeah. But for the sake of variety, I think if I had to pick a close runner-up, I'd actually go with Dennis Hauger. He in F2 this weekend, he finished second in the sprint race, but because the original winner, Richard Verschoor, was disqualified for technical infringement, he technically was the sprint race winner. And then he got himself on the podium with a brilliant move in the feature race, picked up strong points, has definitely put himself into championship contention. I just think an all-round a really strong weekend, and yeah, thought he drove very well.
Martin, final words of you. Who would your driver of the weekend be?
I was really hoping Stephen wasn't going to talk about Dennis Hauger. But I'm gonna say obviously Dorian Pan as well, because I think she's just had a masterful weekend, and I'd be surprised if she didn't pick up the F1 Academy Championship. But I do want to just elaborate a bit more on what Stephen said about Hauger, because I think there is a lot of pressure on him this year. He is third-year driver in F2. He's not with the Driver Academy. He's got a very highly rated teammate in Franco Colapinto. And so there's a lot of pressure on Hauger to deliver, and it might be an F1 seat at the end of it if he can have a really good season, but he's also got to look at future options outside of F1. And I think this year is a really big year for Hauger for that reason, because there's only so long he's going to be able to spend in F2. He's already shown his quality multiple times in multiple championships, whether that be F2, F3, or other series he's competed in. And I think it's a really big weekend for him to get a double podium, including that sprint race win, to get third place on the last lap. I think it's been a really impressive weekend from Dennis Hauger. I think a shout out to Kush Maini, who also, like I said earlier, showed he's got a lot of pace this year. Enzo Fittipaldi as well, winning the feature race by that margin when he took the lead relatively late on and just dropping the rest of the field for dead was very, very impressive. But I think if you're talking the whole weekend, obviously Dorian Pan, but then I'd agree with Stephen. Dennis Hauger is not too far off.
I couldn't pick, and as a host, I don't have to pick. So well done, you guys, for doing it for me. But anybody who is watching on YouTube or even listening on Spotify, if you do want to leave a comment either on our socials or just below the video, please let us know who you thought the driver of the weekend was. It was a cracking weekend of feeder series racing, and we're going to have it all to do again with we've got Albert Park next in F2 and F3, and then we've got F1 Academy, Miami, just in a couple of months. But it's another street circuit, so another load of chaos potentially incoming. Can't wait to see both of them happening. But I'm going to say thank you to Carla, to Stephen, to Martin, and to Chloe for joining us earlier as well. Thank you for everybody who is watching and listening. And if you are watching on YouTube, dropping a like on the video, leaving a comment, and subscribing to the channel really helps us out. And if you're listening, leaving a review on the podcast platform you're listening on is greatly appreciated. Finally, check out feederseries.net for more feeder series insight, including a lot of content from our editors who are really, really turning up the wick and elevating feeder series to new heights. Thank you so much to everybody in the team for putting that content out there. Please have a read because it's excellent quality content that we've got. And follow feeder_series and FS Americas on X and Feeder Series Net on Instagram. You can find the links to all of those, plus where to find everyone in this episode in the YouTube description or the podcast show notes. Until next time, we have been the Feeder Series Podcast. Goodbye.